The winter sun had barely risen when 8-year-old Maggie Voss slipped out of the trading post, pulling her woolen coat tighter around her small frame. The mountains surrounding the frontier settlement held their breath in frozen silence. The cold seemed to seep through wood, metal, and bone alike. Inside, her mother, Clementine, was negotiating with traders who had crossed the narrow passes before dawn. Their horses still steamed with the effort of the journey. Maggie wandered toward the edge of the settlement, where the tidy rows of cabins thinned in the open land, stretched white with frost. That's when she saw him. An old man sat hunched beside the blacksmith's workshop, leaning heavily against the wall as if it alone was keeping him upright. His hands shook violently as he tried to hold a thin blanket around his shoulders. Long gray hair, braided and decorated with bits of leather and beads, framed a weather-worn face. He looked like a forgotten spirit from one of the stories the elders told. This was Sterling Rhodes, though Maggie did not know his name, only that he was freezing. People passed him without stopping. A few stared, then looked away, too preoccupied with their errands and worries. Their shadows slid over him like cold wind, but Maggie slowed. She watched him struggle with the blanket, watched it slip again and again from fingers stiff with cold. Something tugged in her chest, a mix of instinct and compassion far too big for her small frame. Without hesitation, she unbuttoned her coat. The cold bit her instantly, stinging through the thin dress beneath. She hesitated only long enough to swallow the shiver rising through her bones. Then she stepped forward. "Sir," she said softly, "you need this more than I do." Sterling lifted his eyes, expecting another fleeting stare, maybe even a comment about him being in the way. Instead, he found a child holding out her only warm garment with both hands. He studied her, face searching for mockery or pity, but her expression was pure, earnest, unforced. Slowly, almost reverently, he accepted the coat. Warmth seeped into his body, but something deeper stirred inside him, something ancient. For the first time in decades, a spark, he thought, long faded, flickered awake. Maggie smiled, hugging her bare arms against the cold. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that her simple act had just awakened an old tradition from Sterling's people. A sacred response required when someone performed a selfless gift with no expectation of reward. They called it Sahani Nuka, and it demanded that her kindness be honored in a way that would echo across generations. Sterling Rhodes stood for a long moment after Maggie disappeared into the trading post, letting the warmth of her little coat seep slowly into his trembling frame. But the warmth he felt had little to do with fur or fabrics. Something older, something sacred had stirred within him. Something he had not felt since he was a young man, listening to his grandfather speak of ancient obligations by firelight. What the child had done was no small kindness. It was Sahani Nuka, the selfless gift, a gesture so pure that it awakened a tradition older than any building in the settlement, and older than most living memory. Few among the settlers knew the weight of it, and fewer still would have believed such an old custom could be revived by the actions of a single child. Yet Sterling knew what he had to do. He pulled Maggie's coat around his shoulders, steadier now, and began the slow walk east toward the tribal settlement where his great-nephew, Gideon Nash, lived and led their people. The wind stung his cheeks, but purpose carried him faster than he had moved in weeks. He replayed the moment in his mind, the child's small hands unbuttoning her coat, her bare shoulders tightening against the cold, the fearless sincerity in her voice as she said, "You need this more than I do." Such an offering was rare even among adults, but from a child it was nearly unheard of, and that made the act even more sacred. Their tradition required a response, not merely a return gift, but a circle of generosity. A ceremonial recognition meant to teach everyone who witnessed it about the power and holiness of selfless sacrifice. And according to the old ways, this response had to be meaningful, not grand for the sake of being grand, but deeply connected to the heart of the one who gave. Sterling knew that time was short. The ceremony had to begin before the sun reached its peak the next day, a detail that weighed on his mind as he walked. When the first huts of the tribal settlement came into view, he spotted Gideon outside repairing a bridle. Gideon's head lifted immediately, sensing something unusual in Sterling's approach. When Sterling recounted the story, the coat, the child, he watched Gideon's face grow still with reverence and gravity. "Sahani Nuka," Gideon murmured, a breath more than a whisper. "It has been so many seasons." Without hesitation he rose, gathering the other families with quiet urgency. Word spread like a spark catching dry grass. Elders stepped out of their homes with solemn faces. Women paused their work to listen. Children gathered in clusters to ask questions about a tradition they had only heard about in fragments. Within minutes, preparations began. Blankets were brought out, ceremonial garments aired, wooden carvings and sacred items retrieved from places of honor. By the time Sterling sat beside the fire to warm his hands, he knew the wheels of the ancient tradition were turning once again. All because one little girl had chosen compassion over comfort. The tribal settlement felt different that morning, alive in a way it had not been for many seasons, as word of the Sahani Nuka spread from hearth to hearth, carried by excited whispers and the steady steps of elders who understood the weight of what was coming. Gideon Nash moved with calm authority through the center of the village, issuing quiet instructions while the people prepared for the ceremony. He knew that such a tradition, once awakened, demanded precision, respect, and unwavering sincerity. Children ran to fetch smooth river stones, each one to be carved with symbols of gratitude, while the women layered woven blankets dyed in vibrant reds and deep earth tones over a circle of cedar branches in the center clearing. Men tended the fire, adding resinous wood that crackled with a sharp, sweet scent, and sent coils of aromatic smoke rising toward the cold sky. Sterling Rhodes sat beside the flames, feeling the old energy of the tradition humming through the village like a heartbeat. And though his hands still trembled from the cold he had endured earlier, a warmth of pride and purpose spread through him. Gideon knelt beside him briefly. "Are you strong enough to lead the telling?" he asked. Sterling nodded. The story of the child's gift had to come from his lips, for he had witnessed it, and the truth of a tradition's beginning always held power when spoken by the one who was touched by it. By mid-morning, the entire settlement had gathered around the cedar circle, their breath rising in pale clouds, their eyes filled with anticipation. This was not merely a ritual, it was a teaching, a communal act meant to ripple outward like a stone dropped into still water. Gideon raised his staff, carved with the symbols of their ancestors, and the circle fell silent. Sterling rose slowly, leaning heavily on his cane, and stepped into the center. The firelight painted warm colors across his face as he told the story: the cold morning, the bustling trading post, the child wandering alone, and the moment she noticed him shivering against the blacksmith's wall. He described her gentle voice, the way she slipped from her coat without hesitation, and the purity of her intent. A wave of emotion passed through the listeners, some bowing their heads, others closing their eyes to imagine the scene. When Sterling finished, Gideon stepped forward. "We honor the child not for the coat," he said, his voice steady and resonant, "but for the courage to give warmth while standing in the cold herself." With that, the ceremony began. Elders placed carved stones around the fire, forming an unbroken ring, the circle of gratitude, and the people joined hands around it. Drums began to beat softly, building a slow, steady rhythm that echoed the rise of the sun. Sterling felt tears prick at his eyes. This was no small gathering, no simple act. This was history awakening, memory stirring, a tradition returning to life because of a single act of kindness from a child who had asked for nothing in return. As the last drumbeat faded and the fire settled into a steady glow, Gideon Nash stepped forward to complete the ancient duty, lifting the ceremonial bundle wrapped in red-dyed deerhide, its weight symbolic rather than physical, for what it carried was not an object but a promise. The people knew what came next. The circle of gratitude could not remain confined to the village. It had to travel outward, carried by chosen hands, to the one whose act of selflessness had awakened it. Gideon selected for companions two elders, a young scout, swift on his feet, and Sterling Rhodes himself, who insisted on going despite weary bones and the long walk ahead. "This began with me," he said, gripping his cane firmly, "and it must reach her with my own steps." They set out at once, the cold air biting their faces, but the energy of the ceremony warming their spirits. The path toward the settlement wound through stretches of snow-dusted pines and open patches of frozen ground, where the wind moved unhindered. Gideon walked at a measured pace, mindful of Sterling, but the old man surprised them all with his determination. He leaned on his cane only when necessary, his eyes bright with purpose. As they walked, they spoke quietly of the meaning behind Sahani Nuka, reflecting on how rare it was for the tradition to be invoked by someone so young. "Children give easily," one elder murmured, "but rarely do they give something that costs them comfort." The youngest of the group added, "She did not look for praise. That is why the spirits stirred." Hours later, the settlement finally appeared through a veil of drifting frost, its smoke rising gently into the sky. The contrast between the tribal village and the frontier town was striking, one built from curved lines and earth tones, the other squared and stiff, stretching outward in straight rows. Yet the group felt no division as they approached. Kindness had bridged far larger distances. The people of the town noticed them quickly, their arrival stirring attention and curiosity. A few paused in the street, others leaned from doorways, unsure of what to expect. Sterling scanned the crowd for the small figure he remembered from the morning. And then he saw Her Magus stepping out of the trading post with her mother, hugging her thin arms against the cold, but smiling as though winter could not reach her spirit. Her eyes widened in surprise at the approaching group, especially when she recognized her coat wrapped around Sterling's shoulders. She hurried over without hesitation. "You're warmer now," she said happily, then looked at the ceremonial bundle with innocent curiosity. Gideon knelt before her, lowering himself to her height, and the entire street seemed to fall still. "Little one," he said gently, "you gave warmth when you had little to spare. Today we bring warmth in return, not as a gift, but as honor." A hush spread around them as Maggie blinked in confusion, unaware that her simple act had drawn an entire tradition out of the past and into the present right at her feet. The street had gone completely silent as Gideon knelt before Maggie, the ceremonial bundle resting in his hands like something alive, something that pulsed with the memory of a tradition the frontier town had never seen. Clementine stepped closer, instinctively, unsure whether to pull her daughter back or allow the moment to unfold. But the gentleness in Sterling's tired eyes reassured her. Gideon spoke softly yet clearly, letting each word settle into the cold air. "Sahani Nuka," he said, and though the settlers did not recognize the phrase, Maggie felt its weight as though it were made of warm sunlight. Sterling moved to her side, leaning heavily on his cane, his voice trembling not from weakness but from emotion as he retold the story, her story, for those who had gathered. He described how she had seen him shivering, how she had unbuttoned her coat without hesitation, how she had placed warmth on his shoulders while stepping boldly into the cold herself. As the tale unfolded, more townsfolk stepped out to listen, forming a half-circle around the group. Some bowed their heads, others pressed hands to their mouths, humbled by the simplicity and depth of a child's compassion. When Sterling finished, Gideon slowly unwrapped the ceremonial bundle. Inside was not treasure or finery, but a handcrafted blanket woven with intricate patterns of crimson, gold, and deep earth-brown colors of warmth, bravery, and rooted strength. The blanket had been stitched overnight with the hands of the village's artisans, who poured gratitude into each thread. Gideon draped it over Maggie's small shoulders, and the fabric seemed to envelop her with more than warmth. It felt like an embrace from 100 hearts. "This is not repayment," Gideon told her, "because kindness cannot be bought. This is recognition, honor." A circle closed. Maggie looked down at the blanket, fingers tracing the patterns as though feeling stories hidden inside them. "But I only gave you my coat," she whispered. Sterling crouched beside her, his knees cracking softly, and smiled. "Sometimes, little one, a small act can wake the biggest things." Tears shimmered in Clementine's eyes as she knelt to steady the blanket, overwhelmed by the realization that her daughter's simple kindness had touched an entire community. Around them, the settlers stood quietly, their faces softened, their usual guarded expressions replaced by something gentler. One by one, they began offering small gestures. Someone rushed to bring hot tea, another placed a wool scarf over shoulders. A few children shyly approached Maggie to admire her new blanket. For the first time in memory, two worlds, tribal and frontier, met, not with caution, but with shared warmth. The circle that began with a coat had grown outward, binding strangers with respect. As the sun dipped low and painted the snow in gold, Sterling looked at Maggie and murmured, "You reminded us who we used to be." Gideon nodded beside him, "And who we can be again." And in that quiet moment, the old tradition breathed fully to life, not in ceremony alone, but in every heart that witnessed the power of one child giving warmth in a cold world.